Well, we'll talk. All right, guys. We are so excited that you guys have all come out. This is going to be a good night. That David Barton, the exciting part of it is that we've gotten to meet Rich Bott.
Bott Radio right
Bott
here,
Radio,
hosting
man,
this whole night.
You guys have, I mean, you cover our airwaves around here, but man, what, 100 and something stations all over?
That's right, 120 stations across the country, and God is really blessing the proclamation of His Word.
It's just amazing. It's amazing.
And Ron Wimbe, and just for those of you that aren't around from here, this is Ron Tucker. Ron Tucker's the founding senior pastor here at Grace Church. We're glad that you're here. I'm Wes, I'm one of the pastors here as well, but we're just pumped that you're here on a Thursday night.
Right, we are so pumped. We've gotten to sit and talk to David, and this is really going to be a great event. Can I pray for us before we even begin? Because we're turning over to Rich. Lord, just anoint your word, your servant, David, as he talks to us. Just give us revelation like only you can, Lord. It's in your light that we see light. Come among us and speak to us tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Ron and Wes.
Just real quick before Rich goes on. So just so you know, during David's message, we're going to have a number that you'll see right up here. There it is right there. Text your questions. Because David's going to teach for, 50 minutes or so or an hour. And I was listening to him today. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. I mean, it's intense. But you can text your questions because around the top of the hour, we'll come out and we're going to facilitate a time of Q&A. So there's a couple ways to do that. You could text your question as you get it, or also at the end, we're going to have 2 mics down here, and you can come up and ask your question to David then, and that's how we'll end the evening, just so you know. Okay, Rich, go for it.
Thank you, Wes. How many of you get to hear Wall Builders on Bott Radio Network? Praise God. You know, David Barton is a national treasure. He's the premier historian in the whole country, in my view. And he understands the foundations of our country. He understands the foundations of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution because he understands the Word of God. And so we're in for a special treat tonight. I'm so glad that you all came. And I'm Rich Bott, and you may hear my dad and me sometimes on the Complete Story radio program. I'm the one that gives the telephone number. Our listener comment line is 1-800-345-2621. That's me. My dad is the other one. So thank you for being with us. We're going to have a great time. I heard David Barton speak to about 200 pastors this noontime today. It was a pastor appreciation luncheon, and you guys are in for a special time. Watch the video here. We have about a 2-minute video clip to tell you about the ministry of Bott Radio Network, how the Lord has blessed it over the years now to 120 stations. And I want to say that St. Louis for us was station number 4. So we have a very special place in our heart for St. Louis. Please watch the screens, and then after that will be America's premier historian, David Barton.
Celebrating 59 years of broadcast service, Bott Radio Network's purpose is more important than ever to help strengthen your faith, strengthen your family, and strengthen your walk with the Lord. With quality Bible teaching, Christian news, and information 24/7. With 120 stations, Bott Radio Network harnesses the power of radio to spread the gospel. And in the midst of a new age for audio media, we've expanded our reach. Our mobile app for iPhone and Android makes it easy to listen for people on the go. We reach people at home on smart speakers like Amazon Echo, Apple HomePod, and Google Home. They also hear our format of quality Christian talk radio on iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and even on TV apps like Apple TV and Roku. Each media platform allows us to reach more and more people across the nation and around the world.
Today, the world is in desperate need of physical and spiritual healing. We salute the many quality broadcast ministries who are on the air with us, partnering to proclaim the Word of God faithfully and boldly in these days. Most of all, we thank our many listeners who depend on Bott Radio Network every day to help them grow spiritually and apply their faith in their everyday life.
I fell away from the Lord and was heading down a bad path. I'm a taxi driver, and I had a near-death experience on the interstate. After it happened, I turned on Bott, and Dr. Jeremiah was there talking about in the book of James, and he led me back to the Lord that day, and I've been a faithful listener since. Thank you, Bott Radio.
With listeners on 6 continents, BRN is helping to fulfill the Great Commission by broadcasting the Word of God to the people of God in this generation.
Hey, guys. Thanks, guys. Thank y'all for being here tonight. And I want to start with a word that we cover a lot on Wall Builders Live on Bott Radio, and it's the word history. History is significant for a number of reasons. You'll see a bunch of slides back here. You're going to see a lot of visuals as we go through this. But history is a word that is very biblically oriented. The Bible tells us to recall the former days, to remember the former times, to tell your children the things that previous generations did. All that's history. It's all related to history. When the New Testament church was birthed in Acts 6 and 7 with Stephen, Stephen's sermon that he gave was a history lesson. He said, guys, don't you remember what God was trying to do back here? And he took Abraham and he took every generation after that coming forward. You have the thing that you'll find in the Bible that when Israel remembered its history, it behaved very differently than when it forgot its history. And oftentimes, finding its history led to a revival, as it did in the case of Josiah, who was trying to rebuild the temple. He found the scroll in the temple. He said, we used to be like this. And it led to a national revival. So history is super important. I want to show you a quote here, and this quote from, if I get it working here, and it is not liking me yet, it's about to. So here we go. This quote from George Orwell, I want to spend just a little bit of time on it. Quick quote says, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. 2 elements of that. Let's take the first part. Who controls the present controls the past. That is education today. The way that schools teach history today, the way that universities teach history, what we get on history, whoever controls the present controls the past, because they'll tell you what happened in the past, even if it's inaccurate. And that's a lot of what we see going at schools today, and that's why there's so much reaction in school boards, because people who are older go, no, that's not the way history happened. But again, what happens today presents the past. And here's the other part. Whoever controls the past controls the future. So the way you see your past defines what you're going to become as a nation. And that's why what goes on right now, the way we teach history, is so significant. Now, we're going through an era of history teaching right now that really goes back to 1980. There was a guy in 1980 named Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn came out with a book called The People's History of the United States. Now, let me tell you from the Bible standpoint, the Bible covers a lot of history. And the Bible gives you the good, the bad, the ugly. For example, with King David, you get the ugly. King David committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered Uriah. That's really ugly. King David could not control his family. The Bible tells us he never said no to his son Adonijah. His other son Absalom tried to kill David, but Absalom did kill his brother, David's other son Amnon, because David's son Amnon had raped David's daughter Tamar. That's really bad stuff. But we also get the good of David. That is, David repented. He recognized when he did wrong. He came back to God. He became a great worshiper. Most of the Psalms were written by David. And on top of that, David is the guy who delivered their nation. He became the guy that God made a covenant with him. Your children sit on the throne forever because of the way you are. And David killed the lion and the bear, and he killed Goliath, and he led the nation. So David did a ton more good stuff than he did bad stuff or ugly stuff. But it's all there, the good, bad, the ugly. The Bible covers it all. What happened with Howard Zinn, he took everything bad and ugly he could find about the United States, and that's all he told. He didn't tell any of the good stuff, and he even made a lot of the bad and ugly stuff up. Now, this is called deconstruction. We're going to tear it down and show you how bad we are, all the bad things we've ever done in history, and this has shown up in a lot of other ways as well. If I take you to the College Board is what does the SAT test, one of the college entrance exams, but the College Board also does 47 AP courses. Now, an AP course is advanced placement, And if you're a really sharp kid in high school, you can take a course where you get college credit at the same time. So there's about 47 of those courses you can take, and AP is the one who does all the testing for them. They set up the courses. For example, this is the AP US History course. Now, the AP US History course, I mean, it's a very thorough course, and these, again, are the sharpest kids in the United States history-wise. 460,000 students right now are taking this course this year, and it's taught in every single county in the United States. And so as you look at the 162 pages that we have with standards, it's interesting to see what's there, or better yet, what's not there. For example, if you go to the history standards, you will find nothing about founding of America. There's nothing, no founding fathers, no Jefferson, no Franklin, no Madison, none of those guys. There's nothing about an American war for independence. It didn't happen. There was not a Battle of Lexington, or there wasn't anything all the way to the Battle of Yorktown. There was no war for independence. And on top of that, there was no Abraham Lincoln. There was nothing like the Gettysburg Address. There was nothing like an assassination. There was nothing like the 13th Amendment. And if you don't have Lincoln, then you sure don't have the Civil War. And so we don't cover the Civil War, none of the leaders, none of the battles. And if you move into modern times, it's interesting. We have no World War II battles, not D-Day, not Pearl Harbor, not Battle of the Bulge, not Midway, it's not there. We have none of the leaders in World War II. We don't have Eisenhower or Patton or MacArthur or Nimitz. All of those guys are gone. And not only do we not have that, we don't even have Hitler, we don't even have the Nazis, and we don't have the Holocaust. Now, this is a history course about American history, 162 pages standards, and we leave all this stuff out. What in the world are we teaching? Glad you asked. Because what we're teaching, we do teach that America dropped an atomic. This is what the standards say. It says America dropped an atomic bomb. Said the decision to drop the atomic bomb raised questions about American values. Now notice, there is nothing in terms of European theater. There's no Hitler, there's no Nazis, no Holocaust. There's no 48 million that died in the European theater. There's no bombing at Pearl Harbor. There's no Tojo. There's no 20 million that died in the Pacific theater. None of that happened. The only thing that happened in World War II was we dropped an atomic bomb that killed 300,000 people, and that raises questions about our values. You can literally go through the standards and think that World War II was the bad country, or you can go through all the World War II and think that we're the bad country. So this is fairly interesting that we raise questions. How do we raise questions? Let me give you some of the story that's just not covered today anymore. Now, we're very blessed. We own 160,000 items from history, 120,000 items from before 1812. And one of the things that we own that relates to World War II, particularly this issue, is what happened here with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are all leaflets that we dropped. And these leaflets, there are 70 million that we dropped. The reason this is significant is when we get to fighting the Japanese, we've been fighting the Germans and the Nazis and Mussolini for 4 years. Now that we've got them defeated, we did the D-Day invasion, we pushed Germany back, so they're defeated. Now we're turning all of our attention over to the Pacific theater. We didn't yet at that time know that you needed to be able to fight a war on two fronts at the same time. This is one of the things the military now knows is, we were over here doing Germany, and when we got whacked here, we weren't able to fight there. We had to put everything here. So we now know that we need to be able to fight a war on two fronts because the enemy looks to see if you're busy here and they'll attack you over here. So in doing that, what happened was the Japanese hit us, and with all that happened with the Japanese, we learned back then, which we don't learn now, the Japanese people back then are very, very different from what they are today. Their view of life was totally different. They believed it was glorious to die, to take people with you. That's how your ancestors would be honored. And so from the very first, we saw that these people didn't think the same way that we did. We saw, for example, that when one of our submarines early on gave up to the Japanese took all of our sailors, laid them down on the deck of that submarine, and took a sledgehammer and squished every head, just like a melon. We said, whoa, what's this? And then we had the Bataan Death March and the Saipan Death March. If you were wounded, if you were sick, if you fell out, you just got shot. There was anything at all that we were used to. And then we find that they have a genocide. Just like Hitler killed 6.5 million Jews, the Japanese hated the Chinese, and they killed 10 million Chinese. And then they went to Korea and took the women of Korea and brought them back as sex slaves for their soldiers. And then they trained their young people how to deliver suicide bombs, 3,400 suicide bombs that they delivered. And then we find out that as we're fighting in places like Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, et cetera, the Japanese gave every family a hand grenade. and said, if the Americans win, you make sure you blow yourself and your family up. Take all your children out. This is the most glorious thing you can. It was a death mentality. They were the ISIS of that generation. There was nothing at all close to what we understand today with the Japanese, and I'll show you where that culture changed. But nonetheless, that's what we had back then. So here we are, we're going across, and the Japanese should have given up after Hitler went down and after Mussolini went down. They've got no allies left, and they're not winning a single battle in the Pacific. As we did the island hopping, we won every single battle, and the Japanese won't give up. And so we said, okay, we got to start bombing Japan. We're going to have to just go start bombing the island because they keep turning out these planes. They keep turning out these war machines. We've got to stop that. So this is when we dropped 70 million leaflets. What's interesting, on the back of the leaflets, it said, Japanese people, here are the 35 cities that we're going to bomb in Japan. Now, we're going to bomb them because we're going to destroy all military capabilities, but we do not want to hurt a single civilian. So we're telling civilians, get away from these cities, tell your leaders to surrender, but we're going to destroy the military capabilities in these cities. We listed Nagasaki and Hiroshima as two of the cities we were going to bomb. And by the way, you can imagine how our Army Air Corps guys felt about this. No Air Force back then, the Army Air Corps, because now that we've told them the 35 cities we're going to bomb, guess where the Japanese set up all the anti-aircraft gun? Those 35 cities. So we endanger our own lives to say, people, we don't want to hurt civilians, get away. So we do that, and I'm not quite sure how that raises questions about American values, but when we finally decided it was time to drop the atomic bomb, and by the way, this is a radio station, KSAI. Before I tell you about that, what happened was as we are bombing and bombing and bombing and the Japanese won't give up, General Curtis LeMay, who heads the Army Air Corps, says, guys, looks like we're going to have to do another D-Day invasion like we did with Hitler. We're going to have to invade Japan. He said, if we do that, what are we looking at? And so all the experts got together and came back and said, well, if you're forced to do a land invasion of Japan, because clearly bombing is not enough, they're not giving up with all the bombing, destroying all their military capabilities, they won't give up. If you do a land invasion, you're going to lose 1 million Americans. We'll have 1 million died. I actually talked to a veteran who was off the coast of Japan. His task for he and his unit was to build 1 million American coffins, because that's what we're going to have, is 1 million lives lost there. He said, you'll also have, they told him, you'll also have 2 to 4 million Allied lives. So you'll have the Australians, and you'll have the British and the French, and you're going to have to kill between 5 and 10 million Japanese before they will give up. So you're looking at 15 million if you do a land invasion. That's when Harry Truman said, no, don't think we'll do that. We've got a bomb that we'll use. And before we use that bomb, the radio station KSAI, we took the island of Saipan, we set up a radio station there, and every 15 minutes, we broadcast into Japan and said, the bomb is coming, get away from the city. The bomb is coming, get away. It's interesting that not only did we tell them, we also told them we have one bomb capable of doing what 29 B-29 super fortresses can do. So the B-29 bombers bombed Tokyo, it's bombed all over the island. They said, we got one bomb that'll do what 2,000 bombers will do. Don't make us use that. Tell your leaders to give up. So we finally end up using that bomb, and we dropped that bomb. And by the way, I'm not seeing yet the problem with American values, because we're telling them we're trying to save innocent lives everywhere we can. We're going to stop the military, but we're trying to save all the lives we can along the way. And so what happens when we finally drop the bombs, you had 150,000 that died from the 2 bombs from the explosion. You had another 150,000 that died within the next few years from the radiation. You have 300,000 Japanese that die as a result. What's interesting is that's not the same thing as 15 million deaths. And I'm not sure, again, what the problem is with American values here. I'm not sure what they're talking about when they tell people that it raised questions with American values. We stopped the killing. Instead of having 15 million dead, there's 300,000. And 300,000, yeah, that's a high number, but may I point out something else? The Japanese, in one prisoner of war camp, they beheaded more than 300,000 prisoners in that camp. This happens to be an Australian that's being beheaded at the time. The Japanese officers actually had beheading competitions to see who could behead 100 prisoners the fastest. They'd have to have runoffs because they're really good. We'll have to do another 10 prisoners. Each of you get 10. It's just insane. See, the reason we don't know about this is after Japan finally surrendered, after the second atomic bomb, they surrendered on 14th of August. When they surrendered, America put General Douglas MacArthur in charge of reconstruction. What did Douglas MacArthur do? He said, if we're going to rebuild Japan, First thing we need is I need 5,000 Christian missionaries over here, first thing, because we got to change the way people think, and they've got a culture, the military Shintoism they have, women have no place, there's no private ownership of land, it is individual, it is kind of like the nobility and elite was in Europe with kings. They had none of the things that we think about today. So what happened was 5,000 missionaries come in. Within the next few years, the Bible becomes the #1 best-selling book in Japan. Now, Japan did not remain a Christian nation, but Christianity changed their thinking. And within 7 years, they were so changed that the world community voted that Japan should come back into the world community. And they were the butchers of World War II. So here we are talking about how bad America is. See, this is what we're teaching to 460,000 of our brightest history students today. So in addition to what we have with AP US History, which is again, deconstruction, let's tear down America, there are reports done by the American College of Trustees and Alumni. The American College of Trustees and Alumni, they represent all the universities that are out there, the Board of Regents and the Board of Trustees and the alumni boards. And so every year they look to see how certain courses or certain subjects are being taught in universities across America. One year they looked at history majors, this was not long ago, and the way they look at this, that year they will take US News and World Report, what they call the elite colleges and universities in America. That report comes out every year. So this particular year, they found that there were 76 elite colleges and universities in America, and they said, we want to see how these elite colleges and universities deal with history majors. The name of their report was called America's Past, Passed Over, which tells you something about it, because what they found was at the top 76 universities in America, if you go there to get a history degree, now what are you going to do with a history degree? You can teach history or become a curriculum director, write history textbooks, whatever. At the top 76 universities in America, if you go there to get a history degree, at 64 of the 76 universities, you will not have a single course in American history, not even one, as a history major, which is why you have schools like George Washington University. It's one of those top 76 for history majors. They no longer require any American history course at all if you go to American University, to George Washington University to be a history major. And then you've got the University of Wisconsin. University of Wisconsin doesn't even offer history majors anymore. 32 universities have done this in California. You can't even get a history degree if you want one. We're not going to teach you any history at all. So what we're doing is eliminating anything we know about our past, and what we do know about our past, we re-portray it in a bad light like we did with World War II. We're not going to talk about Hitler or the Holocaust or anything else. So we see things really changing. We see it also changing in the statewide standards. Now, we have a network at Wall Builders of 1,000 legislators. We have legislators in all 50 states we cooperate with and work with. We'll monitor up to 110,000 pieces of state legislation a year. So we pretty much know what's going on in most states and what's happening there. And states will every 10, 12, 14 years pass their new standards, their new health standards, their new literature standards, their new English standards. And this year, a number of states, like others years, they passed their history standards. In Texas, our history standards go about 14 years before we come up with new standards to replace them. And Minnesota's 10 years. It's interesting, this year, the states that passed history standards, so many of them said, well, we've decided that for our coming 10, 12, 14 years, we are no longer going to teach anything on the American Revolution or on the Civil War or on World War I or on World War II or on the Holocaust. All that's going for the next 10 to 12 years. So we're not covering it at all. I actually went to Louisiana to testify in the legislature this year because they were trying to keep that stuff in. Louisiana's a conservative state, it's a red state. We want to keep the Civil War in. We want to keep the Holocaust in. On the floor of the Louisiana legislature, they said, no, we don't want to keep Civil War in. That's going out. And we don't want the Holocaust. That's going. And so the sponsor of the bill just pulled the bill down rather than let them vote on taking all the history out of it. So, I mean, this is going on all across the country right now. And so when you see this, because we don't know our history, is why we see such a rapid rise in things like Marxism and socialism and communism. This is where stuff is taken off. None of this would have been accepted 30 years ago because we knew too much about our own history. Today, we know so little about our own history, we buy into this. Now, let's not ignore the fact that these three forms of government have never been successful in the history of the world. There's not a single occasion where people maintain their freedom and their prosperity in any of those three systems, so that's all right. We're willing to throw out what we have and try something we've never tried because we've just learned that's going to be the best thing out there. So this kind of stuff, this is where you see the rise of critical race theory. Now, critical race theory, there's a lot of groups that we see out front very much espousing this. What is characteristic with all these groups and with critical race theory? And by the way, Critical race theory goes back to what's called critical theory. Critical theory is something that Marx promoted in 1848 in his book, Das Kapital. And so critical theory says you have to have some kind of critical thing where people fight each other. You always need fighting. That's the only way this thing works. You have to have two groups fighting. So for years they've tried all sorts of things in America. They tried things like class. Well, that didn't work because America has too much upward mobility. Then they tried things like economics, the rich against the poor. And that didn't work because, again, we have too much upward mobility. And so they've tried stuff for years and years. This time, they've tried critical race theory. And this works because nobody wants racism in America. People really don't like it. We all want to be tender-hearted. And so this works, plus we don't know our own history. So what's happening with critical race theory, and all these things exemplify themselves with rioting, rebellion, and radicalization. That's why you see all these groups being violent, tearing stuff down, all these peaceful protests that are killing people and destroying billions of dollars of damage. They're all peaceful protests. No, they're not. This is what characterizes any form of Marxism at any point in time. It's just that right now, the version they've taken includes race as the trigger point. So when you look at critical race theory, in case you don't know what it is, let me just give you a simple definition of critical race theory. Critical race theory takes as a starting point that America was founded to protect and preserve slavery. That's interesting. Founded to protect and preserve slavery? That's not accurate. I'll show you that in a minute. But what they're talking about here is what the 1619 Project did. They're talking about Jamestown. Jamestown is the first colony in America. Jamestown colony, you go back to 1607, that's when it's founded. So the 1619 Project is talking about a colony founded in 1607. But the reason they chose 1619 is because 1619 is when the slaves first arrived in Virginia. And America was founded to protect and preserve slavery, and we can see that at Jamestown, except there's a little more to the story. What happened was a Portuguese slave ship was sailing by Virginia out off the coast. Two of the English privateer ships, kind of like English pirates, they went and attacked the Portuguese ship, and they took everything off the ship. They got all the loot, all the booty, everything off the ship, and the ship had about 40 slaves on it. And so the two English ships divided it. You get half, I get half. There's 40 slaves. You take 20, I'll take 19. It was right around 39, 40 slaves. And so they said, what are we going to do with slaves? That keeps us from attacking other ships. Well, let's go to the nearest colony and drop them off. And that was the Jamestown colony. So one of those ships with 19 slaves came to Jamestown and said, we've got slaves. You guys want to buy some slaves? The people in Jamestown said, no, slavery is illegal in Jamestown. We're not going to buy any slaves. They said, well, I don't want them. So he just dropped them on the shore and took off. What happened was those 19 slaves that got dropped on the shore, they went through what everybody else in Virginia had gone through, and that's called an indenture. Whether you're white or black, the state runs the stuff, the state owns the land, the state's got everything, and you're going to be a drain on the state. We're going to have to feed you, we're going to have to clothe you, teach you some kind of a profession. So what you're going to do is you're going to work for the state the next 3, 5, 7 years, whatever your indenture is. At the end of that time, you will have carried your load, and we, the state, will give you land. You will be a free landowner. So that's what all the whites went through. That's how people came to Europe came to Virginia from Europe. They came under indentures. And so what happened out of those 19, one of them was a guy named Anthony Johnson. And Anthony Johnson, one of the 19, at the end of his indenture, he becomes a wealthy, prosperous landowner. Over the years, he grows, increases the amount of land he owns, and he starts sponsoring indentures. And people come on his indenture. He says, I'll bring you to America. Let's say you're in France or Spain or Portugal and say, hey, I want to go to America. Great stuff over there. How much it costs? $10,000. Ooh, I've only got $300. How do I get over there? Well, I will sponsor your $10,000, but what you're going to have to do is when you get here, you're going to have to work for me for 7 years, and if you'll work for me for 7 years, I'll get my money back, and you'll be here, and then you'll get land, and you'll be a free landowner. And so that's what happened. He was sponsoring all these people to come. And one of the guys he sponsored was a guy named John Kaser. Now, John Kaser, as it turns out, he worked his indenture, but when it came time for him to get land, Anthony Johnson was very dissatisfied with what happened with John Kaser. He didn't like what was going on. He didn't like the fact that he hadn't done all the stuff that he wanted him to do. And so he went to court in 1653. And in 1653, Anthony Johnson, a black man, sued to own John Kaser for the rest of his life. If you let me own this guy for the rest of his life, it'll probably pay off what I've got invested in because he just hadn't done good. So the court said, yeah, you can do that. That's the first occasion of slavery in America when a black man sues to own another black man, and the court says yes. This is where chattel slavery in America began. Now, you'll never hear that in the 1619 Project. Oh, Jamestown, slavery, it's where it all began. Yeah, that's where slavery did begin, was there, but it wasn't 1619, it was 1653, and that doesn't count all the other colonies that had a very different reaction. For example, Massachusetts, the second load of slaves that came to America came to the Pilgrims, the Bible-based people in Massachusetts. And the Bible-based people in Massachusetts, they freed all the slaves and imprisoned all the slave owners, and they quoted out of the book of Exodus where the Bible says that man-stealing is a capital offense. And the Pilgrims said, look, it says there, if you steal someone from one land and take them to another land and sell them, that's man-stealing. That is a capital offense. We will not have that going on in our colonies. That's the way most of the colonies were, especially those in the North. They were not founded to protect and preserve slavery. They fought exactly the opposite. We'll come back to that later. So critical race theory takes as a starting point that America is founded to protect and preserve slavery, bad history, and that the American constitutional system is the source of our society's ills. And what's the greatest societal ill we have today? It is racism. So if you want to get rid of racism, what you're going to have to do is get rid of that constitutional system that gave you racism, which is why we see the attacks that we see now against the Constitution, against so much that's there. It's a bad document, it's a racist document. Now, it's interesting, 3 weeks ago Monday, the National Archives, which houses the US Constitution and houses the Declaration of Independence, they came out with a new warning label for those documents. That warning label for the Constitution is now called harmful language alert. Don't read this because it has harmful language. Wait a minute. Don't read the Declaration. The race language in there says that all men are created equal. Is that the harmful part you're talking about? No, just take our word. It's got really bad stuff. You don't want to read it. And wait a minute. The race language in the Constitution, are you talking about the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery? Or the 14th Amendment that gave equal rights regardless of race? Or the 15th Amendment that gave voting rights regardless of race? Is that the? No, just trust it. It's just got bad. When you read it, you don't see the bad stuff. You see lots of good stuff, but just don't read it. It's got harmful. See, we're just saying don't even look at the documents. Don't know about our history. Don't study our history. Now, what happens as a result of what we've been going through for a number of years now, we no longer have the appreciation for our own country we once had. Let me give an example. America right now is one of 193 nations in the world. UN, there's 193 nations this year. It goes up and down every year. But it's interesting, we had a revolution in 1776 in America, and we wrote our Constitution and adopted it and went into effect in 1789. We've had one Constitution since 1789. Look at the other nations in the world, see how they've done in that same period of time. Look at how many constitutions other nations have gone through while we've had just one. Now, it's interesting that we have stability in a way that no other nations ever enjoyed. And it doesn't matter whether these nations are friends or enemies. They've all got the same problem. They've all got the same record. And so when you see all this, a good question to ask is, how long does the average Constitution last? And over 5,800 recorded years of American history, the average Constitution in any nation lasts for 17 years. Last September the 17th, Constitution Day in America, we celebrated our 234th birthday. Now, that's something. I actually like the fact that we don't have a new constitution every 17 years, or that like other nations, the average for nations is they experience a violent revolution every generation and a new constitution every 17 years. See, we don't understand how special America is, and we just want to blow it up, tear it down, and do something different. We'll end up like everybody else. So if you want to give all that away, let's talk about being like everybody else. And then you've got things like creativity. America represents 4% of the world's population, and 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. Not for us. When you measure creativity using copyright, patent protection, et cetera, our 4% of the world's population has produced more technology, more medical discoveries, more scientific discoveries. It's produced more space technology, more entertainment technology, everything than the other 96% of the world. We're so used to what we have, we don't understand how different it is. Now, I'm a cowboy from Texas, and so very simple, basic life. I really like the cowboy life. We have a ranch out in Texas. I like being there, but I do a lot of stuff for the U.S. military. I've got 2 active duty kids in service right now, and the U.S. military oftentimes has me go to the bases and do trainings. Thanks, guys. So the military had me go to bases and do trainings for officers, soldiers, whoever. And so they asked me to go to Germany and do some bases there. And so I went to Germany. I think there's 26 or 27 bases there. But they were really nice to me. Here's this cowboy out of Texas, and they put me up in a 5-star German hotel. And I tell you, that was impressive. I mean, this is old world elegance. You got castles, things are thousands of years old over there, and the service was just unbelievable. I would walk in, they say, Mr. Barton, welcome back. They call me by name. They recognize me just walking in through the door. It was really cool. And that 5-star German hotel would have been even cooler if they would have had internet at the hotel. Didn't even have internet. You go, wait a minute, guys. Do you realize that even Motel 6s in America all have internets? We are surrounded by so much we take for granted, and the same happens when you look at our prosperity. Our 4% of the world's population produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product. Now, what we know, every 10 years, the Constitution requires that we have a census, and we had it last year, and it was released in April this year, and according to numbers from the census, if you live in poverty in America, your lifestyle in poverty in America is higher than the middle class in Europe. As a matter of fact, the World Bank sets the poverty level for the world at $2.50 a day. If you make $2.50 a day or less, you're in poverty. That's the World Bank. That means about $1,000 a year. Yet here in America, we have states like Hawaii and states like Mississippi saying, hey guys, unless you make more than $58,000 a year, you should not come off welfare. You stay on welfare unless you can get above $58,000. Really? And the rest of the world saying 1,000 years poverty? We don't understand what we have, and what we have is very different. We are the exception. We are not the rule. We're not like every other nation. And that's where we got the term American exceptionalism. It came from a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville in 1831. He wrote the book Democracy in America. And America is the exception, not the rule in so many areas. And it's significant. How did we end up being so different? And the answer to that is probably our leaders. I mean, that's a good place to look. You can say, you know, George Washington had a huge impact on who we became, and so did John Hancock, and so did John Adams, and these are all great founding fathers, and they're the ones who birthed the nation, and those answers are all fine and they're acceptable. But interestingly, in 1816, a young man named Hezekiah Niles went to John Adams and said, I'm writing a book on the history of the American Revolution. Now, I wasn't there for when it happened, but man, do we enjoy what America has become today. So 1816 is 40 years after the Revolution. He says, I'm writing this book. He says, you were an eyewitness back there. I wasn't alive back then, so I want to ask you, as a key participant, as an eyewitness, who do you think was responsible for what we enjoy in America today? And Adam said, well, if you want to know who I think was the most important in what we have in America, he said, right up top, I'd put the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. I'd also put the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. Oh yeah, you got the Reverend George Whitefield. And don't forget the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He goes through and starts listing preachers. Now, we might know who Whitefield is today, but the chances that we know anything about Cooper or Mayhew or Chauncey, slim to none. We don't cover preachers whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen or Absalom Jones, or who is John Moran, or who is Lemuel Haynes, or who is Harry Hoosier? Harry Hoosier is a fun one. Let me take Harry Hoosier just because all these guys are super significant. We just don't know our own history today. Harry Hoosier, he was one of the preachers in the Great Awakening. And back in the first Great Awakening, you had Whitefield, and you had John Wesley and Charles Wesley, and you had Francis Asbury, all these famous guys, and they drew massive crowds, thousands, tens of thousands out in the pastures, out in these open fields. And Francis Asbury said, yeah, but Harry draws larger crowds than I do. Really? That's big crowds. And then you have Benjamin Rush, signed the Declaration, who ratified the Constitution. John Adams said that of all the founding fathers, he's the third most notable. He said you got George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. We don't even know who he is today, but Benjamin Rush said, I've heard Harry preach, and he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Oh my gosh, you've been hearing Patrick Henry and all the really good guys. No, nobody's as good as Harry. Now, Harry ministered to blue-collar kind of folks. Those are the folks drawn to him, and particularly the frontiers guys, the woodsmen, the trappers, the explorers, the guys that really had a rough and rugged life. I mean, they were tough guys, and justifiably so. You needed to be tough back in that environment with what they went as they were moving west. And so these guys, the thing that happened was with this rugged and tough guys and this rugged, tough lifestyle, as they got converted, their lifestyle would change. Their language would change, and their drinking habits would change, and their behavior. They're still tough, but they're just a little different than what they were. And so what happened, Harry had preached all along the East Coast. And so in Philadelphia and in Delaware and in Jersey, all these places he had preached. But as America started growing up and moving west, by the time you get to 1806, 1807, thereabouts, America's gone west, and a lot of these converts of Harry Hoosier have gone west too, because they're the trappers and the explorers and the mountain men. And so as they get out and they end up going west, By 1806, 1807, they're out in this Western territory, and the other trappers look at these guys and say, these guys are really different. What's up with them? And the answer was, they're a bunch of those Hoosiers. Now, you should be able to associate Hoosiers with the Indiana Territory. I wonder how many people who live in Indiana know that they were named after a black evangelist. Probably very, very few. Now, you would think that a dude that has a whole state named after him, you'd think that a dude that has a whole state named after him might actually get mentioned in somebody's history book. Not by a long shot. We don't even know who Harry Hoosier is, even though they knew very well back in the day. A lot of history about this guy. So when you see what happens back then, and by the way, let me just live here for a minute, because critical race theory and all the stuff that's happening now and how America is fundamentally racist. And yes, America has racism. America has had racism. Do you know why America's had racism? Because it's had people. Racism is a sin. As long as people have sin, you're going to have that. But it's just like David. Not only is there the bad and the ugly, there's a whole lot of good, and we're not getting any of the good, we're getting all the bad and the ugly. So I want to kind of live here for a minute. I want to take you to something that happened with Harry Hoosier, or not with Harry Hoosier, something that happened in April of 1775. This is when we had the first battle of the American War for Independence. This is when Paul Revere made his midnight ride. He was looking for John Hancock and Sam Adams to say, hey, the British have sent 700 guys to find you two. They want you hung on the spot. You guys need to make yourself scarce and move out of here. So as Paul Revere goes and makes that ride, we think about Paul Revere, and yet today we don't know that there were a bunch of other people also making rides. Some of the other folks that were making rides was a guy here named Wentworth Cheswell. Now, Wentworth Cheswell, interestingly, was a black patriot who made a Paul Revere type of ride. We just don't talk about him. And Wentworth Cheswell is a significant guy. In 1768, he was elected to office in a white community. He was a judge. This is one of the documents we own from him as a judge. And elected in 1768, he was reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions. He was a black man being elected in a white community? Yeah, because this is the New England area. This is not Virginia we're talking about, it's the New England area. And by the way, you go all the way back to 1641, we had black folk being elected by white communities. Or you go to Thomas Hercules, who was elected, Matthias de Souza was a 1641 guy, but Thomas Hercules is a black man elected in white colonies, or white counties in Pennsylvania, because they said, this guy does the job better than anybody else. We're just looking for competency and quality. We don't care what color his skin is. And so there's that whole story that we don't get told. But nonetheless, Paul Revere is making his ride. And so what happens was he lets them know, and by the way, Wentworth Cheswell is one of the most notable names in Massachusetts history. He is a patriot. He's actually the guy who did the history of New Hampshire. I said Massachusetts history, New Hampshire history. So the 3-volume set, the first history of New Hampshire, he's the guy who did it. So Paul Revere is looking to make this ride to let the patriots know the British are coming, and that's what happened. Lexington Green, 700 British showed up, and they had the battle with 70 Americans. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But what happened that morning was 18 Americans hit the ground, and among those who hit the ground were black patriots like Prince Estabrook and white patriots like John Robbins. Black and white hit the ground together because they all went to church together. This was a church that turned out to defend the town. And even back in the day, at that point in time, we actually built monuments to Prince Estabrook. We still build monuments to Prince Estabrook today. He's not an insignificant name. He's very significant. He recovered from his wounds. He went on to fight throughout the Revolution. He was a Minuteman to George Washington. Really good guy. We just don't know anything about him. Now, if you go from there and go, for example, to what happened in June of 1775, this is the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill, we whipped the British 3 times in a row, and they kept charging up the hill, and we kept shooting them, and they went back, and they'd retreat. We finally ran out of ammunition. We ran out of ammunition. Now the British are winning the battle, and they charge up the hill, and our guys are getting slaughtered until this man over here. This is Peter Salem. Standing right beside him is Thomas Grosvenor. Peter Salem was the hero of this battle. He's the guy who saved all the American lives that day. As a matter of fact, after the battle, 13 white officers wrote commendations that said, this dude has got to be promoted. None of us would be alive if it wasn't for him. This is the hero. He was so much a hero of that battle that for generations our textbooks covered what he did. This is a textbook from the 1840s. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill, and who's the hero out there standing by himself where you can see him and everybody knows who he is? It's Peter Salem. By the time you get to the 1880s, we have colors in our textbooks, and so this is a textbook from the 1870s, 1880s, and who's the hero of the battle? It is Peter Salem. And by the way, another hero of that battle was a guy named Salem Poor. He got the same kind of commendations that day. You got to promote this guy. He's one of the best guys fighting for us. So we have all these black heroes we've never heard about, even though they appear in our paintings. And then if you jump into July of 1777, this is one of my favorite stories in American history. July of 1777, we have a problem because Charles Lee has been captured by the British. Now, he is our second in command. You got George Washington, then you got General Charles Lee, and at that time, the American military was a bunch of shopkeepers and a bunch of school teachers and a bunch of farmers trying to become a military, so we needed all the professional military guys we had to try to teach us how to be a military, and that's why you needed George Washington, but you also needed guys like Charles Lee, but now he's been captured by the British. That's a serious setback to our army. The only way you can get him back is you're gonna have to have a prisoner exchange, and that means you gotta exchange somebody of equal rank. Well, he's number 2 in the American Army. You got to find the number 2 in the British Army and capture him and exchange him. Number 2 in the British Army is a guy named General Richard Prescott. Turns out General Richard Prescott was well protected. He was out on an island in the center of the harbor in Rhode Island. He had the entire Navy around the island. He had a fort, and he was inside the fort, inside a locked room. He was very, very safe. So there's no way we're going to get him, except a guy named Colonel William Barton says, I don't know. I've got an idea. Maybe there's a way. Let me see what happens. And so he came up with this plan, and what he did was he called his troops in. He said, guys, I've got a plan. It might work. It probably won't. It's probably going to get us all killed, but I'm going to try it. And I don't want anybody volunteering. I don't want anybody in this unless you volunteer. You have to volunteer. But if you want to, I need some guys to go with me. And so 40 guys volunteered, 20 blacks volunteered, 20 whites volunteered. One of the first guys up, and by the way, this is really the start of what we would call special forces. This is our first special forces mission back in the day. And the first guy up was a guy named Jack Sisson. And man, he was eager for this, and he's ready to do it. He's a great fighter, a great soldier. And so as the ships take off, he's right up in the front ship, right up at the front of that ship, he's leading the way off. And so what we do is we take out about 2 o'clock in the morning. And we take out, and we have to get past all the British ships. And so what they did was they installed what they called mufflers on the oars. So as they're roaring through the water, they've got cloth wrapped around the end of the oar so it doesn't go splash, splash. It goes whoosh, whoosh, real quiet. So they get under all the British ships. Then they make it to the fort in the middle of the island. And when they get there, the British didn't think anything was coming because nothing happened on the ships. So they knock all the British guards out on the island. And they start looking for where General Prescott is. And they find that he's back in the center of the fort. He has hidden himself, barricaded himself behind a really big oak door with a really big oak bar on the inside of the door and wrought iron hinges. And they say, we're going to have to beat the door down with hammers. And if we do that, we're going to waken everybody. We'll all be dead. It was at that point that Jack Sisson says, no, I've got a plan. And what Jack Sisson did for me is very reminiscent of the movie Princess Bride, if you've ever seen Princess Bride. I'm going to show you a clip of the movie Princess Bride. You remember this clip if you've seen it? You remember Diego trying to get in the door and boom, there you go. So what happened was Jack Sisson said, you guys get out of my way. And he backed up down the hall. And that big oak door with that big oak bar, wrought iron hinges, he lowered his shoulder, lowered his head, and went right through the door. Busted the oak, busted the hinges, busted the bar in the back, and he goes barging right into the general's room. The general sits up in bed, what's this? And Jack reaches over and hits him once and knocks him out cold. He then picked him up, put him under his arm like a sack of potatoes, and he walked back out, got in the boat, and took the boat back over. And that's how we got... That is a Hollywood movie waiting to happen. That would be a really fun story. One more that I'll share with you because there's so much I could go through. But in 1781, at that point in time, a guy who was really important was General Marquis de Lafayette. He was the French general, came here when he was 19. Washington loved him, ended up adopting him as a son after the war was over. And you see Lafayette standing with this black man right here. Now, I often ask students, who's that black man? And the instant response, oh, it's his slave. No, Lafayette hated slavery. He was a huge anti-slavery guy. The guy standing with him is a guy named James Armistead. Now, James Armistead, good friends with Lafayette, and as they were talking, he said, I want to do something to help. I got to do something, because James Armistead lived in Richmond, and the British had come to Richmond and burned it and just ravaged it and destroyed it. And James said, I got to do something to help. And Lafayette said, well, General Washington just put me in charge of intelligence, because we don't know what the British are doing until they hit us. We would really like to know when they're going to hit us ahead of time, so we can't be there and save all these lives. And he said, so I'm looking at intelligence. And James said, oh, I can do that. I'll go do that. No, James, I'm talking about being a spy. No, I'll do it. James, look, if you get caught, you're dead. You don't want to do it. No, I'll do it. So James decides he's going to go be a spy. So what he does is he goes straggling into the British camp. And as he goes in, he said, oh, I hate the Americans. They so mistreat me. They're so terrible. Will you kind British please take me in? They said, sure. So he gets in the camp, and he starts serving in every way he can. Everything a soldier needs, he goes and gets it for him. I'll grab that for you. You want some water? Whatever it is, he just serves and serves and serves. And the officers are watching this. And one of the generals in the British Army goes to James and said, you're doing a really good job of serving. But as good as you are, you don't need to be serving common soldiers. You need to be serving generals like me. And so he says, would you come serve me? And James said, sure, I'll be happy to. Now, the general who asked him to do that was a guy named Benedict Arnold. Now, Benedict Arnold was a great traitor of the American Revolution. He'd been an American general, but he tried to kill Washington and sell out West Point. But the British rewarded him by making him a British general. So now Armistead is right there with the general hearing all these plans, and he gets the word back to Washington, back to Lafayette. Here's what they're going to do. Here's what they're planning to do. And so as time goes on, the British attacks are less effective, and General Benedict Arnold set out on a mission. So they send him on a mission. And when he leaves, James Armistead stays at the camp. But Lord Cornwallis, who's the commander-in-chief of the British forces, he comes to James and says, James, you've been serving Benedict. Would you be willing to serve me? He said, sure, I'll be happy. So now he's in the tent of the commander-in-chief. He's there for every military meeting, hearing every British general and all their plans, and he starts smuggling this stuff back to Lafayette and Washington. And suddenly these British ambushes aren't working anymore because we're not there when we're supposed to be. And it's really not working the way it was. And so one morning, General Cornwallis came in, and he walked right up to James, got close to him and said, James, we have a spy in the camp. And James was like, oh, busted. Except it wasn't. Cornwallis said, and I don't have a clue who it is. But what we're doing is not working anymore. Somebody's leaking the information to the Americans. He said, I don't have a clue who it is. He said, and I know that you hate the Americans. They so abused you and mistreated you. But I'm going to ask you to do something really, really hard. Would you be willing to be a spy for me and go find out who the spy is that's talking to the Americans? And oh, no, don't make me do that. Okay, for you, I'll do it. And so he goes back. He's the first double spy in American history. He took all the good information and fed it to the Americans, all the bad information and fed it to the British. And the result of that was that when Cornwallis decided to go down to Yorktown and be down at Yorktown for the winter, Lafayette said, hey, this is your chance, Washington, and, Armistead told Lafayette and Washington, this is your chance. He's going down to winter quarters down here in Yorktown. And this time, the Americans were ahead of him and waiting for him when he got there. And he wasn't prepared for that. And that ended the American War for Independence. So the American War for Independence ends because of the intelligence work of a black man. And Lafayette and others say, hey, this is the guy that brought the American War for Independence to an end. And this is kind of like your first, not special forces, your first Army intelligence. But what's significant is if you go back to the start of the American Revolution, John Adams said the American Revolution started not with the Declaration of Independence. John Adams said the American Revolution started with the shedding of the first blood at King Street. Now, King Street, what you have at King Street, this is at that point in time, they called it a bunch of different things, but we call it the Boston Massacre. And the first man killed in the Boston Massacre was that man right there, a black man named Crispus Attucks. Now, isn't it interesting? The Founding Fathers said the American War for Independence started with the death of a black man, and it ended with the intelligence work of a black man. You can't tell the story of American independence without telling the role that blacks played throughout, and yet we managed to do it today. We managed to leave all of this out. And one other thing I'll point out is the American the American Army back then was a total volunteer army. It was just everybody's volunteer. And so if you enlisted, it was a 6-month enlistment. And that's what you served. The average white man served 1 enlistment. The average black man re-enlisted 8 additional times. The average black man served 9 times longer than the average white man did. And in every single battle of the American Revolution, you not only have black participants, you have black heroes in those battles that played significant roles, and somehow we've kept this out of our history books. Now, it's not that it's unknown, and we look at these guys today and say, boy, that's a bunch of white guys, isn't it? No. You don't know all the black heroes that are there or all the Hispanic heroes that are there, what the women of Cuba did to raise money for George Washington, keep him in the field, what Bernardo Galvez did, or Dave de Saavedra. So many Hispanic heroes that we have. And even if you look at George Washington's generals, he had 76 generals, and 28 of his generals came from foreign nations. We were a melting pot even back then. It's not at all the way we're told today. And when you look back then, notice all these black faces popping up. Now, I'll point out to you, back then, nobody had cameras. So to get a portrait, you had to be super significant. You had to be a famous person to get a portrait done of you back then, like the presidents or like some of the founding fathers. We don't even have portraits for all the founding fathers. And look at all the black heroes we have portraits for, because they were that important throughout history. Now, somehow we've managed to lose that. We don't even know that in 1792, John Hancock held what was called an equality ball. Founding father John Hancock, governor of Massachusetts, held a ball in Massachusetts to celebrate the equality of blacks and whites, because there never was a time in Massachusetts history when blacks could not vote. Now, the guy he's with happens to be Paul Cuffey, who's the wealthiest black man in America, had a prospering business, free market guy, had businesses in several colonies. We don't even know the names of these guys anymore. And so how did we lose all of our history? And the answer is this guy right here, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson becomes president of the United States, but before he did, he was a professor in 3 different universities, really intellectual guy. And in 1902, he did this work. This is called The History of the American People. It's a 5-volume set. I have the 5-volume set signed by Woodrow Wilson. So the 5-volume set came out, and the other progressive academics said, oh, this guy is so smart. He's professor in 3 universities, and he now has given us a systematic history of the United States. We've never had anything like that. This is so good. And so what happened was, the next year, Princeton came to him and said, man, that is such a good set. Would you consider being the president of Princeton University? And he's the first non-clergyman to become president of Princeton University. So he becomes president of Princeton, and they say, you know, this guy's so good. The people said, we ought to elect this guy president of the United States. So he becomes president of the United States. Now, what's interesting about Woodrow, and this is the book that did it. This is the set that did it. Suddenly, all the academics love this, and they got to teach it. What's interesting about this stuff is when you look at what Woodrow Wilson was doing, he was a hardcore racist. As a matter of fact, when he got to Washington, D.C. as president, he took every black person serving in federal government and fired them all except one guy. He left one in because he wanted a token black. He also is the guy who birthed the second revival of the Klan. It was Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, who brought it back. And in the White House, he did 2 screenings of a Klan recruiting film called Birth of a Nation. And interestingly, that Klan recruiting film, the script for it had come out of the history book that he did. So the Klan recruiting film came out, and then when that Klan recruiting film was shown, and the film was shown all over the United States, the Klan came out and said, hey, we're the heroes that Woodrow Wilson's been telling you about. We're here at the theater so you can see some real live heroes. We're the ones that Wilson's talking about. The Woodrow Wilson administration marched open with the Klan in the streets of Washington, D.C. So this is Woodrow Wilson. He is a definite hardcore racist. And the interesting thing about his history books, you can go through that history book and you know there's not a single black person mentioned anywhere in his history books. He took all black heroes. He even took Frederick Douglass out, and Frederick Douglass is photographed more often than Abraham Lincoln, and even he's gone out of the books. But since he doesn't talk about black folk, in case you've never seen a black folk, he does give you a picture of a black folk so you can know what they look like. That's Neanderthal. That's Woodrow. Are you kidding me? Woodrow Wilson says he learned this from a mentor. He said he got this from Charles Darwin. He said his administration was based on the policies of Darwin. He says he had learned social Darwinism. And if you remember Darwin's famous book, 1859, this is the book that he did. It's called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, but there's a title below that. That's interesting. Today, if you want to buy that book by Darwin, all it says is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, but if you keep going, it says, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. What do you mean favored races? Darwin explains. He says, what I've done is I've talked to you about how that man has evolved and how other species have evolved, and some races are just better than other races. And so what he did was he came back with this next book, The Descent of Man. And in The Descent of Man, he says, I talked in The Origin of Species about the evolution of various species and man, but now let me just focus on man for a while. And so 8 times in this book, he says, the darker your skin, the less evolved you are. So if you have dark skin, you need to go back to Africa until your skin turns white, and then you can come back to America with the rest of us. If you want to cancel somebody, why don't you cancel Charles Darwin? I mean, this knothead. This is where racist Woodrow Wilson credits his ideas with coming from, and this is why we don't know our own history today, because progressives said, he's such a progressive, he's a great guy, man, we got to model everything we do after his academic philosophy. So we just cut blacks out of history. We don't even talk about it, and there's no shortage of what's back there. So all of that being said, Woodrow Wilson is the root cause of all this, and we're just historically illiterate today about what actually happened. And that's why critical race theory can work, because we don't know what we used to know. We don't cover this anymore, and this is why what happens in schools is so important. So seeing what we got here, I'm going back to John Adams, because all of this started when I told you that John Adams says there's preachers responsible for what we have in America. How can that be? Historians have documented that every single right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. What that means is the Declaration of Independence is actually a listing of sermon topics that we covered in the pulpit for 15 years leading up to the American War for Independence. Now, when you think about the role that we had back then, pastors helped shape our thinking and everything. This is why John Adams said the pulpits have thundered. We had so many sermons that were covered. Any topic you can think of, whether it was science, whether it was education, whether it was military, whether it was economics, whether it was criminal justice, whether it was issues in the news, anything. They had sermons on everything. We have 260 of those old sermons posted on the Wall Builders website. We own thousands of them. We put 260 up, and they're topics I've never even seen covered in a pulpit before. And this is what we did. See, what they believed in back then was addressing biblical relevancy. Now, it's striking to me today that when you look at where we are today, all these issues popping up on the screen, these are all issues I chose specifically because they've been in the news in the last 24 months and because the Bible also specifically talks about them. But the problem we have today is only 1 out of 16 Christians can name the biblical principles that go with each one of these issues. We're the most biblically illiterate generation in our history. Only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. We don't know how the Bible applies anymore. And when it comes to pastors, polling shows that only 2.8% of pastors today are willing to talk about things that are in the news from the pulpit because they say, oh, that's politics. It is not. There's so much out there that the Bible deals with in the culture. You don't stop talking just because that's what Jesus talked about stuff. He would point out stuff in the culture all the time and use it to teach his disciples. So we've seen a lot going here, and we've seen the results in America. We just, the 2.8% is just unbelievably low, and the result has been the downturn in Christianity in America. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the year 2000, 85% of Americans said that they were Christians in the year 2000. Last year, it was down to 65%. So we've dropped 20% in 20 years. And when you ask these people, why did you stop going to church? 2 out of 3 says because it lacks any relevancy. I don't get anything that's useful for my life throughout the week. So it's significant. This is part of why we see people praying for revival. We've got to have a revival in America. We need a revival. We're praying for revival. And I think those are really good prayers. Nothing wrong with those prayers. But the problem is I don't think they're going to get answered the way that people think. I think the major problem we have is we have a national obsession right now. Let me see if I can explain this. Everybody gets their news from somewhere, but generally, those that are on the right will get their news from Fox, or they're going to get their news from Victory News or Newsmax or The Blaze or something else. Those on the left are going to get their news from CNN or MSNBC, whatever it is. Everybody gets their news from a national source, which means you haven't heard a story about Watertown, New York. You haven't heard a story about Jacksboro, Texas. You haven't heard a story about Scottsbluff, Nebraska, Yukon, Oklahoma, etc. We get a heavy dose of national stuff, and that's why nearly all of us, we can talk with some authority on what's going on in Congress, with what's going on with the Supreme Court, with what's going on with the White House. We know about that stuff, but you know what? There's none of us that can make any kind of a significant difference on any of that. And let me just kind of put this in perspective. I'm very engaged in all of those arenas. I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, involved in another case at the Supreme Court this year, no justices on the court, and yet I can't get them to make the right decisions or what I think would be the right decisions. And most of what we faced with the culture war in America came out of the courts. It was what we're doing right now, what we're doing at this case this year, the case we're involved with, that case out of Mississippi, where they're trying to say, hey, you can ban abortions after 15 weeks. And what we're trying to do is get the court to go reverse its own opinion from years ago. Most of the problem we have right now is the court's opinions from years ago. We're just trying to get them to reverse those opinions and give our country back to us. So we got problems with the court, but you know, the same way, White House. I've been dealing actively with the White House because 2 weeks before Afghanistan fell, you saw what was happening at the Kabul airport and all the stuff happening, throwing babies over the fence and the explosion at the Abbey Gate, et cetera. 2 weeks before that airport shut down, the military, and back up. In December of 2015, a guy named Glenn Beck, national media personality, good friend of mine, he created what was called the Nazarene Fund to save persecuted Christians. At that time, we were taking them out of the Middle East, out of Iraq and Syria, elsewhere. And so now, as Afghanistan starts to fall, and Glenn and I have run that organization for the last 6 years, and as Afghanistan is starting to fall, we see persecuted Christians now as a serious problem. ISIS going door to door looking for Christians, beheading them and burning them if they find them. They're looking for the allies, the Americans, the interpreters, the SIVs. If they find them, they hang them on the spot. So we're watching this chaos, and the military contacted us and said, hey, would you guys take charge of all the civilian planes that were trying to get out of Afghanistan? You guys should do it. So we took and ran the civilian side of the airport in those last 2 weeks. And so what happened in that period of time, and by the way, over the last 8 weeks, we've been able to get about 9,000 people out of Afghanistan, including thousands and thousands of Christians, hundreds of Americans, hundreds of SIV holders. Just got a bunch of the Afghan female judges out of there. Afghan female judges had put 7,000 terrorists in jail. And when the Taliban came in, they turned loose all those 7,000 terrorists, and they instantly went for the judges who had put them there. So we've been able to get those judges out of Afghanistan. So we're doing all this, and you know, as bad as the Taliban is, the biggest problem we've had is the State Department. They've been a bigger problem than the Taliban because we've had planes in the air where the State Department says, you're canceling your clearance. Turn those planes around and go back. We're getting people out. We had planes going to Macedonia, a Christian country, and State Department called ahead and said, no, don't accept those planes. Turn them back to Afghanistan. And planes going to Albania, another Christian country. No, turn them back. The State Department has been really crazy on this. And so went to Secretary Blinken and contacted him and said, hey, we need help. And he said, no, I'm not giving you any help. So then I went to a bunch of the senators and a bunch of congressmen I know in Congress, said, guys, we need help. And so they started leaning on Blinken, and Blinken said, okay, we'll help. And so he started saying, okay, get these guys out. He got the State Department officials together and said, let those planes out of Afghanistan, get them out of there. The State Department told Blinken, said, we're not going to. What do you mean you're not going to? I'm your Secretary of State, get them out of there. We're not going to. People don't understand that under the Civil Service Act that we had passed in the 60s, you cannot fire a federal employee. If you recall back to what happened with all of the veterans' deaths at the veterans' hospitals a few years ago, thousands of veterans died from the incompetency. Did you know that only one person got fired in all the veterans departments, veterans' hospitals? And it was because we passed a bill in Congress to fire one person. It took a bill to fire a person. It's incredible. See, if you remember back even the days of Ronald Reagan, he stood at the Berlin Wall and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Within 5 minutes, the State Department put out communication to every other nation saying, that does not represent our views. What do you mean that doesn't represent your views? That's your president. So they don't care whether the president's Reagan or Biden, they're going to do what they want to do. So I'm telling you, I've had all sorts of problems with all three of those branches, and I've got better connections than most people do, and I can't get a single thing done with them. It's just frustrating. And that's where Americans are. We get all this national news and we're paralyzed because we can't make any of those three branches. None of us can do that. But the problem is we're looking at the wrong place. We're seeing national instead of local. Let me take you back as I close this down and just kind of refocus maybe on what I think the Lord's doing right now. When you go back to the American War for Independence, if you take the first 4 battles of the American War for Independence and going from top right around, you have Lexington, then you have Concord. Bottom left is Road to Boston, bottom right is Bunker Hill. All of those battles, nobody contacted George and said, George, you're the national commander-in-chief. We just had 700 British come to town. There's only a few hundred of us that live here. You got to get here quick and help us. Nobody contacted George at all. They all said, it's our community. We'll take care of our community. You got other stuff you need to do. And it's interesting, more than 80 battles in the American War for Independence, George was involved in very few. Now, we really needed him. We needed him at Yorktown. We needed him at Brandywine. We needed him in Monmouth. But nearly all the American Revolution was won because of all the local battles we won. So let me take you through these 4 real quick. That first one with Lexington, it happened that on the morning of April the 19th, 1775, 700 British come to town. Now, we're told in our textbooks that 70 brave Americans from town went out there to face the British. That is not accurate. What happened is the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark went out there to face the British. Jonas Clark had been telling the guys, he said, guys, if it comes to war, you need to understand the Bible will not bless an offensive war. The Bible will bless a defensive war, but not an offensive war. So if they shoot at you, you're allowed to shoot back. That's a right of self-defense. That's Exodus 22, and that's Nehemiah, and that's Luke, and all these passages, but you cannot start anything. So when the British came to town, 700 of them, 70 men from his church went out there and faced the British. And the head of the church, then the deacon, John Parker, said, now remember, guys, pastor's been telling us we can't fire at these guys until they fire at us. So this is where you hear the famous line that's engraved in stone there at Lexington from Captain John Parker, Deacon John Parker. He says, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And so what happened was, and by the way, everybody back then used the same weapon. You didn't have SEAL team guys because everybody had a single shot musket, and it took everybody 15 to 20 seconds to reload it. Doesn't matter how good you were. So everybody stuck with it. And then on top of that, you got 700 British out there. There's 70 of us here, and they get the first shot. They did. And that's why 18 Americans hit the ground that morning. No British hit the ground at all, 18 Americans, and that's where you had black patriots like Prince Esterbrook we looked at, John Robbins, they went to church together. It was the church out there defending it. Well, after the British have that battle, they go into Northbridge at Concord, and that's where, again, history books say 300 brave townsmen went out to meet. No, it's not. That was the church of the Reverend William Emerson, who took his church out there to defend the town. And when they got out there, they said, hey, you guys, we've heard you've already fired at our brethren, so now we get to fire back at you. And that's where the first British hit the ground, is right there at Concord, Northbridge at Concord. And at that point, the British said, this is not going well. We had 70 Americans facing us. Now we had 300 Americans facing us. There's only 700 of us. If these numbers keep growing, we're in serious trouble. We got to get back to Boston quick. So that's the road on the Battle of Boston, 19 miles back to Boston. And all along that road, they did have trouble because 4,500 Americans lined that road on both sides to stop the British. Now, where'd those 4,500 Americans come from? Well, Benjamin Balch brought his church out, and Reverend Payson Phillips brought his church out. It's all... It was all the church saying, you're not going to do this kind of tyranny in our community. This is our community, and you're not going to do it. See, this is what we see throughout. And even with the Battle of Bunker Hill, we talked about Peter Salem, the hero there over on the right. Battle of Bunker Hill, the Reverend Joseph Willard said, I got 2 companies in my church. Let's go join all the other churches, throw all of our companies together. That was the Battle of Bunker Hill. Churches showing up with companies out of their church. So you see what happened in the American Revolution was we won the national battle because we kept winning local battles. And it's that local focus that we got to get fixed on, is that the stuff that happens locally. Now, I mentioned we're praying for revivals. We've got to have a revival because the nation is just so goofed up now. But it's interesting. Revivals have the same thing. Revivals, you pray for revival, what you're actually doing is you have to focus locally. No, we don't need a national revival. We need local revivals. Let me see if I can explain that, because people say, well, we had national revivals like with George Whitefield, the First Great Awakening. That's a national revival because look what Whitefield did. He preached for 34 years. He preached 18,000 sermons, And 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Now think about that. That's message penetration, when 80% of Americans have physically heard you. But you remember they had no big tech back then. So what does that mean? That means he was in 80% of the communities in America. He was the chaplain in the colony of Georgia, and he got on his horse in Georgia, and he rode from Georgia to Maine, and he stopped at every town he could find along the way, preaching as he went. And then he rode back from Maine to Georgia, different route. And then he rode from Georgia back to 7 times. He went back and forth, taking a different route every time, preaching wherever he was, finding different communities. Preached over here, 500 people, and they had a revival in that town. He preached here in Philadelphia, 12,000, they had a revival there. He preached over here, Westchester, 1,500, they had a revival there. Preached over here, they had. So what he's doing is he's having all these local revivals all over the United States, and that's how it became a national revival. It wasn't national, it was local, but so many localities had revivals, it was national. And see, that's why we don't talk about people like this guy, Samuel Cooper. Remember, he's one of the guys John Adams pointed out. He's the guy who kept the revival going in Boston area. He was a preacher in Boston. He kept that revival going for years and years and years after it got started. And the same thing with Gilbert Tennant, who kept the revival going in Philadelphia. And the same thing with Samuel Davis, who kept the revivals going out in the valleys of Virginia. See, these are the guys that kept the revivals. It's not a national revival. It was a whole bunch of local revivals that took over the nation. And it's that local stuff. Now, let me see if I can take this local focus and bring it down to something specific that we can do. I want to take that local focus and take it down to voting. You're tired of hearing about voting. Last year's election is the election that won't end. It's still going. And so people are just tired of hearing. Let me just give you some stats. Under the Constitution, if you're a voter in America, only 2 things. You have to be a legal citizen, and you have to be 18 years old. If you're that, then you're a legal voter. Now, we also say, well, we do want you to register so that maybe 7 people can't vote in your name. So we want you to register. But right now, only 65.3% of Americans are registered to vote. All you got to do is fill out a paper. We have 120 million Americans who have said, I don't care what happens in the nation. I'm not going to be part of nothing that goes on. So we've checked out 120 million right from the start. Now, there's 2 kinds of elections in America. Presidential elections is one we had last year. Over the last 11 presidential elections, the average turnout for the last 11 presidential elections has been 54%, but not 54% of adults, 54% of 65% of registered voters. 54% of 65% means that 36% of adults vote in a presidential election, roughly over 1/3. And it takes half of that to win, which is 18%. Now, next year what we're going to have is called an off-year elections, when we choose our governors and when we choose our senators, et cetera. And in the last 21 off-year elections, the average voter turnout has been 38%, but 38% of 65% means only 26% of adult votes, and it takes half of that to win, which is 13%. So, for the last 11 presidential elections, 1 out of 5 Americans has chosen the President of the United States. For the last 21 congressional elections for governors, et cetera, it has been 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and our senators and our reps. That's not high turnout. And then when you look at local elections, the average local election has a 6% turnout. Now, 6% of 65% means only 4% of adults vote in local elections. It takes half of that to win, which is 2%. Let me show you how this works. Let's take a city like Los Angeles, one of the largest cities in the United States. Los Angeles is so large that Los Angeles, being the mayor of Los Angeles is like being the governor in 23 individual states. That's how big Los Angeles is. Its population is bigger than 23 states. Eric Garcetti is the mayor of Los Angeles, and he is faith hostile. He wants to shut down all the churches and punish all those Christians. He brags that he was elected mayor of Los Angeles with 2.9% of the vote. That's really small. Let's take my state of Texas. Let's go to Houston. In Houston, that's one of the large cities as well. The population of Houston is larger than the population of 20 individual states. And Houston elected Anise Parker as their mayor, and she was elected at 4.9%, but that's 4.9% of 65%. She was elected with 3.3% of the vote of Houston. Now, once she got elected, she said, you know what? I am so tired of hearing you guys say that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's a personal attack on me for you to say marriage between a man and a woman. Time out, Anise. We were saying that before you were ever born. We were saying that back when God said it in Adam and Eve in the garden. This has nothing to do with you. This has to do with what we believe the Bible teaches. It's not a personal attack on you. Well, she said it was, and so she passed what was called HERO. That stands for Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. The 200 largest cities in the United States have passed these equal rights ordinances or equal rights amendments or human rights ordinances, human rights amendments. Whatever the name is, they're all the same. So for example, San Antonio passed, that's one of the big cities, they passed this equal rights ordinance. In San Antonio, if you say that marriage is between a man and a woman, it is a Class C misdemeanor, you will be fined $500 a day. If you say that marriage is between a man and a woman, you can never hold office in the city of San Antonio, and you can never do business for the city. You can't be a paving contractor or landscaper or anything. So that's what, 200 cities. So in Houston, she says, if you say marriage between a man and a woman, that's a hate crime, and I've heard some pastors say that. So she went after 6 pastors, and she said, you 6 pastors, I've heard you say that, and I'm subpoenaing all 16 forms of your communication. I want to see all your sermon notes. I want to see your published sermons. I want to see your texts. I want to see your emails. I want to see everything you've done, and we're going to nail you for this hate crime. Well, when that happened, the people in Houston said, whoa, that's not why we chose you, Mayor. We chose you to fix what the problems were, fix the streets or whatever. And so what we did is we got 4,500 churches in Houston involved. And they said, we need a referendum on this. Let's put it on the ballot, let the city vote on it. So the 4,500 churches got the signatures, they put it on the ballot. And the day before the election, it's either the Houston Chronicle or Houston Post ran an article that said, we've done a poll on this, and mayor's going to win by 60-40 margin. These Christians are going to get their teeth kicked in. It's going to be a big loss. The next day when the election happened, instead of a turnout of 3-4%, we had a 14% turnout, and we won the election by 22-point margin. It wasn't even close. We just crushed it. Let me take you to another Texas place. Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, the Fort Worth Independent School District 6 years ago said, hey, we've decided we're not going to do genders anymore. So we're going to let kids pick whatever bathroom they want. They can pick whatever locker room they want. They can pick whatever shower room they want. We're having no more genders in the Fort Worth Independent School District. You can just pick whatever you want. What happened was Arnie Duncan, who was the Secretary of Education for President Obama, picked it up and said, that is a great idea. He came out with a new policy that says, if your school gets federal funds, you cannot have gender bathrooms, locker rooms, or shower rooms. If you get federal funds, you can't do this anymore. Now, I've got to tell you, for people like me, cowboy from Texas, this is particularly disturbing because the nickname of Fort Worth, Texas is called Cowtown, USA. And I will tell you that for any cowboy, we have no difficulty determining the gender of any of these critters right here. This is a really simple thing to do. Any of you can get behind these critters and tell who's the bull, who's the steer, and who's the cow. It's a really easy thing. And so here we've got Fort Worth, Texas. And by the way, I'll just point out, I've never seen a bull become a cow or a cow become a bull either. It's not only is it not hard to detect what they are, I've never seen them change. So what happens is I looked at Fort Worth, and Fort Worth has 800,000 voters. The president of the school board who came up with this nutty idea got elected with less than 1,200 votes. It was 1,182 votes. So I looked in his district where he ran and instantly found an evangelical church with more than 3,000 adults in the church. They could have easily kept him from being there. That one church could have stopped this policy from going across the nation and stopped the gender nonsense we've had for the last 6 years that came out of a local school board. So this is, again, where the local battles are. If you can win your local battles, you can win some national battles. A couple of more quick examples. If you go to Bentonville, Arkansas, this is the hometown of Walmart. 40,000 people up in Bentonville. Christian lady up there said, I'm running for school board. You sure ain't doing this in my school. And by the way, pardon me, in Texas, we use ain't for a whole lot of stuff. That's a great word for us. So if you don't understand that, she says, you are not doing this here. So I'll get rid of the ain'ts if I need to do that, clean it up. So she ran for school board. And in that town of 40,000 people, she got elected. There were 35 total votes cast in that election in a town of 40,000 people. She won with a total of 35 votes cast, but that's not as good as Riceville, Iowa. Riceville, Iowa, a farmer here, northern part of Iowa, said, you're not doing this in our schools. And so he said, I'm running for school board. Put his name on the ballot. He's running for school board. It turned out that on election day, he got busy out on the farm and ended up not voting. And don't think that he lost by one vote, because that's not what happened. What happened is no one at all voted in that school board election. Had he voted for himself, he would be on the school board, simply had he voted for himself. See, these are the local things that we're not paying much attention to. If we can get that local focus, things will change. Of course, this does mean we need to get involved in government in a way that maybe we haven't. Benjamin Rush, I introduced him to you earlier. He's the guy who started the first abolition society in America. He started the first Bible society, the first Sunday school movement in America. But he's also called the father of public schools under the Constitution. In 1790, he came out with this piece. He said, you know, we used to be 13 different nations. Now we're one nation with 13 colonies. What are we going to have to teach in our public schools if we're going to be a strong nation? He said, well, the first purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve God. He said the second purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve their family or their country. And the third purpose of public education is to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, please notice the order: God, country, family. We would say, no, I think family is more important than country. I think I would put it God, family, country. He said, no, that's wrong. It is God, country, family. Why that way? Because Benjamin Rush pointed out that if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy to your family. So keeping your country intact is one of the best ways of keeping your family strong, and that's what we're seeing at schools now. So much of the cesspool stuff that's coming at us in the culture has come out of our schools. And that's why you're seeing people running for school board now, like I'm involved in a state right now with 178 school board races. Now, I've done everything from dog catcher to president of the United States, and 30 years I've never had 178 races put together, and in one state, 178 people running for school board saying, we're cleaning this stuff up. You're not going to do this in our schools with our kids. So this is... But to do this means you have to have good candidates running for office. Where do you get good candidates? The Bible tells us. The Bible tells us a great story. It's a parable of the trees of the field in Judges 9. And it says that the trees of the field got together and said, hey, we need a ruler. We need civil government. We need somebody over us. And so the trees got together and went forth to anoint a king over them. They went first to one of the really good trees. They went to the olive tree and said, olive tree, come down and reign over us. You need to be our leader. And the olive tree said, no way. Olive tree says, should I leave my fatness whereby I honor both God and man and go be promoted over the trees? They said, well, if we can't get the olive tree, maybe we can get the fig tree. So they went to the fig tree and said, come down and reign over us. And the fig tree said, no, I'm not willing to do that. The fig tree said, should I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go be promoted over the trees? They said, well, if we can't get the olive tree or the fig tree, maybe we can get the vine, because that's a good one. And they said, come be our ruler. And the vine said, not me. The vine said, should I leave my wine with cheer both God and man and go be promoted over the trees? Now notice what's happened here. All of the good trees in the forest have said, no, I don't want to get involved in that stuff. They've all had reasons why they couldn't get involved. So if the good people won't get involved and run for office, what happened next in that parable? It says that next the trees of the field said to the bramble, ooh, that's not going the right direction. They said to the bramble, come rule over us. And wouldn't you know it, the bramble was willing to be their ruler. The bramble said, well, if you anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. Just as a question, how much fun is it to sit in the shadow of a thorn bush? Just not a whole lot. That's what we've been doing in America for a long time. We've got too many thorn bushes ruling. There's a lot of good people that have not stepped up. They've had reasons not to. We've had these thorn bushes ruling. So how do you avoid thorn bushes? Well, this is where the Bible also gives us guidance. If you want to avoid thorn bushes, the Bible tells us in Exodus 18:21, Moses at the time, he was out at the mountain with the children of Israel. God's delivered them, and he's the only leader for 3 million people. And he's solving every problem they got. And his father Jethro comes to him and said, you are crazy. He said, you need some help. And this was Jethro's advice to him. He says, provide out of all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. Bro, you need local, county, state, and federal level leaders, what we'd say 10s, 50s, hundreds, thousands. And the people you put in office need to be able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Now, it's interesting. Moses took that to heart, and he said, provide out. How do you provide out? Well, he tells us how he provided out over in Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 16. He recounts his story. He said, and so what I did was I went out among you, and I found people with those qualifications. He said, I brought them to you, set them in front of you, and then you elected who you wanted out of that. Oh, so what we got here is somebody's recruiting, and then you're having elections. One of the good ways you get good people in office is you have to recruit them for office. You have to go aggressive. See, too often we wait to see who's going to show up and put their name on the ballot. Not a good way to do it. All the good guys will always have reasons why they can't do it. You've got to be aggressive with it. And so that's what Moses did, and that's what you find throughout the Bible. So many other times, Samuel went out and said, Saul, God said, you're it. You're the ones that needs it. Saul said, I'm not the dude. I'm hiding behind the baggage. I don't want to be king. No, God said, you're it. Same thing with David. So all of these examples we have, and what you learn in politics is you want to elect people that you don't have to lobby. Now, I've recruited a lot of people for office, and I will tell you, in all the years I've recruited, federal level, state level, local level, I have never once called any person I've recruited for office to ask them how to vote. You need to vote for marriage as a man and woman. Now, make sure you vote against abortion. I recruited them because they had the right beliefs. If I have to lobby them, I've already lost the battle. The people I helped put in office are there, so I don't have to call them. They already believe those things. So if you want to elect people you don't have to lobby, that means you have to recruit people you don't have to lobby. Last thing tonight, I know I've kept you a long time. Last thing is with Charles Finney. Charles Finney is part of the Second Great Awakening revival. It's estimated he led 100,000 people to Christ just in 1 year in that revival. That revival affected tens of thousands of pastors. This is where the Underground Railroad got started, was out of his preaching. This is where the organized abolition movement got started. All the students that went to his university had to be actively engaged in the Underground Railroad, and his university was the first in America that treated blacks and whites, men and women as equals. This guy changed the landscape because of all those he affected, all the other preachers. So he wrote a book in 1835 telling you how to have revival. He said, you don't need to be praying for revival. You just need to do things that'll bring revival. Because if you remember verses like 2 Chronicles 7:14, the Bible says, if my people will do this, this, and this, then I will hear from heaven and heal their... You remember all that good stuff? Well, if you want this, don't be praying for it to happen. Just do the stuff he told you to do. If you'll do this here, he said, then I will do this here. He said, that's how revivals are. So he looked at all the verses in the Bible that were if, then. If you'll do this, then God will do this. He said, you don't have to pray for revival, just do certain things. And so it was how to experience revival. And lecture number 15, this is what he taught. He says the church must take right ground in regard to politics. Politics are part of a religion in a country such as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. Now, that's powerful stuff, but maybe the biggest part of this to me is it was revival lecture number 15 called Hindrances to Revival. In other words, if you want to hinder revival, then stay out of politics. That's not what we've been taught for the last 30 or 40 years. That's what history teaches. That's what the Bible teaches. We got to get a different mindset on this. So if all this is new for you, I can send you the book at the back, The American Story or the Founder's Bible or other things that will help give you a lot of guidance with this. Thanks, guys, for letting me share with you. Wes, back to you, bro. Thanks, bro. Thank you. I apologize. I was supposed to go about an hour, and that was an hour and 20, so forgive me. But thank you, guys.
Okay, here's what we're going to do. Because I know some of you weren't expecting staying late. If you need to step out, you can. I want to really encourage you to hit the resources out there. However, if you're ready to go, we can do a few questions. There's been many that has come in. I'm Bob and Phil. If you'll come up here and hit these mics here. Actually, you know what, Bob and Phil, don't worry about that. I have several that have come in here that are really, really good questions. We're just going to start right here, and we'll just go for a little bit.
And if you guys need to go, totally understand. Kept you late. If you want to stay and hear questions and answers, happy to do that too.
I feel my first question is, when do we get our honorary history degree? Do you sign that on the way out? That was incredible. Okay, this first thing right here, David, just what does the name Wall Builders mean? Give us a little bit.
The name Wall Builders comes from the Bible book of Nehemiah. We have nothing to do with the wall in the southern border, although our state is doing a whole lot of that right now. Wall Builders is the Bible book of Nehemiah, and it was all about Nehemiah rebuilding things in the nation that had been torn down. Back in that day, the wall was a sign of the strength of a city. If you didn't have a wall, you didn't have any protection at all. So the enemy would tear down your walls, and when those walls were down, you had no definition over who you were as a people or a culture. So Nehemiah comes in and says, come, let's rebuild the walls that will no longer be a reproach. What we saw in the book of Nehemiah was the greatest grassroots story in the Bible, where when average people got involved in helping rebuild, what they all thought they couldn't get done, 52 days later was finished. So that's that local kind of stuff. Everybody did their part on the wall. They didn't do the whole wall. Everybody did their little part, and it gets rebuilt. So we like the story of Nehemiah, but we like the name Wall Builders from the concept of everybody rebuilding what they've got right around them. If you can get that rebuilding done, the whole thing will come together.
Excellent. There's a question. I have several questions in here from teachers. So as a teacher, I see the degrading of teaching our history. How can I point students to the truth despite a curriculum that is doing the opposite?
The way you can point students to truth, there's two things you can do. A number of states have passed what's called the American Heritage Education Act. You don't have to have this law in your state for it to be there because the Supreme Court has said you can do this. One thing you can do is you can teach original documents without any form of censorship. As a matter of fact, no matter how religious those original documents are, you're free to teach them. And you'll have people say, well, you can't teach religion in class. I didn't. I'm teaching history in the classroom. And if George Washington says religion and morality is the indispensable supports of America, I'm just teaching history. So what you can do first off is you can teach original documents, no matter how offensive their content might be today with religion or morality or something else, they're original documents. The other thing you can do, the good way to supplement history, I'll point to the Bible. I mentioned earlier the Bible is at least a history book. It's much more than that, but it's at least a history book. And if you look at the history that's taught in the Bible, can you tell me when David killed Goliath? And the answer is no, you can't. And so I'll say, how come you can't tell me? Because the Bible doesn't tell us. And I'll say, how come the Bible doesn't tell us? Because it wasn't an important point. One of the things that happened with Woodrow Wilson is we changed from biographical history to dates, names, and places. We went to events. God in the Bible teaches biographical history. He teaches you the stories of David. He teaches you the stories of Peter. He teaches you the stories of Samuel. And this is the way we used to do American history. We knew biographies and read the stories because we can connect with people. We can imagine what it's like to be in their shoes. Today, we teach dates, names, places, events. We need to go back to biographical stories. So one thing you can do in the classroom is find some great heroes and teach stories about them. You know, teach people like I was talking about Lemuel Haynes or teach Peter Salem. You can teach biographies all day long, and that's a good way to supplement curriculum. And so adding biographies and going to original documents are two ways you can really change the content and still be within the complete boundaries of what you're allowed to do.
Good. I had a question in this, several on this as well. When you were going through the history of what history is being taught and what's not being taught, what's the end goal? Why? What's the commitment to this? Where's this going?
The end result is if I can make you look bad in the nation you're in, I can make you want something different as a new nation. If we still knew our history and realized how remarkable and how just much of an exception we are, we wouldn't want something different. But if we look at our history and say, oh, we've been bad all the way through, we've been such bad people. So history is what it takes to change a nation and cause them to say, all right, I'm done with who we were. Let's be something totally different. Let's just start again. If you're content with your family line and what's happened there, even though you got some thieves in your family line, you got some guys who are real jerks, you got a lot of heroes. If you teach history that way, you'll be content with the product and you'll be willing to preserve it and protect it. And that's what we had done for so long. That's why we taught our country and what was good about it as well as the other stuff. But that's the answer, is it changes public policy. It changes what you're willing to tolerate. It changes what you're willing to put up with.
So as a parent, you know, when I hear you teach this kind of stuff or expose this, you know, my first gut reaction is pull my kids out of public school. And there ain't no way my kids are going to public university or state universities. So how do we get this, if the curriculum is from federal down, how do we get this kind of curriculum of real American history back into our schools? And what advice would you give to parents right now as far as their kids in this public education?
Jesus asked a question, says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? I would ask the question, what does it profit you if you lose your kids? You've got a great education and lose your kids. Right now, we know that when Christian people who have been raised in church go to secular universities, right now, within 4 years, between 81 and 88% of them renounce their faith. So current education is so hostile to faith and values, the chances are 81 to 88% you will lose your kids as a result of that education. Is that worth it to you? The other question that goes with that is at Christian universities. Right now, the number is 50% of kids renounce their faith at Christian universities. How can that be? Because the professors at Christian universities got their degrees from secular universities like Harvard and Princeton, Yale, all these others. So what we have now is people just repeating what they were taught. Jesus says in Luke 6:40, every student, when he's fully taught, will be like his teacher. So we have teachers not teaching original documents, not teaching truth, not teaching history. They're teaching what they were taught. So the thing you have to do is, first thing I think, is you have to preserve your kids, because you will stand before God and he'll say, I gave you your kids, what'd you do with them? Well, I lost them all. That's not going to be a good answer. So we have to preserve the kids. Now, does that mean I can't get involved in other forms of education? No, the courts give you what's called taxpayer standing. As long as you pay school taxes, you have a right to be involved in every single thing that goes on in school. We had a school last week tell a parent, oh, you don't have any kids here, you can't be on the curriculum committee. Oh, no. You can definitely be on the curriculum committee. Matter of fact, you can run for school board. As a matter of fact, you can run for State Board of Education. We need folks with Christian values getting involved because 88% of all students come out of public school right now. That means 88% of your future leaders coming out of public school. If you want leaders that are going to be over you in medicine and in religion and in government and everything else that don't know anything about America, that's not good for you. Just out of selfishness, you ought to be involved with every public school around you. Protect your kids, make sure they get a sound education. Right now, I checked the numbers about 2 months ago, and right now, on average, if a student is homeschooled or educated in Christian schools, on national testing, they come out 2 to 4 grade levels higher than students in public school. Now, that's because, again, you saw some of the content that's there. You can get a whole lot better content. So I would just say, protect your kids. That's my advice. You may think differently, but be involved in the public school system. Be a public school teacher. I've got friends who are homeschoolers who helped run the State Board of Education in Texas. Our state board members represent 2 congressional districts. That's a big election in Texas, and we were able to change the direction of the state because we put good, solid folks on those areas. So just because you might homeschool or Christian school or charter school your kids, do not back out of the system. Stay involved in that system. That's where 88% of the students are, and they need good information. They need good education as well.
Talk to us a little bit as you go around the country, encourage us. I mean, what do you see the Lord doing? I mean, it's easy right now to get discouraged, but what do you see the Lord doing in the church, but also within politics as well?
Church and politics both. Let me take politics first because I'm really involved there. I have never, let me say this differently. I'm not a fan of Christians. I don't really like Christians. I like biblical people. And I say that because right now, 91% of the U.S. Congress identifies as being Christian. You think 91% of Congress is Christian? Right now, you can be a Christian that believes in abortion, believes in killing kids. That's not biblical. Just because you wear a lapel pin that says you're a Christian doesn't mean you are. So I'm tired of hearing the word Christian. I use the word biblical now because that's a big distinction. Big difference between being biblical and being Christian. So while 91% of this current Congress professes to be Christian, we have the largest body of biblical thinkers in Congress that we've had in my lifetime. We have what's called the prayer caucus. That prayer caucus, that's these biblical guys. They get together, and I say guys and girls. We're from Texas. Guys is a dual pronoun in Texas. So these guys in Congress, every Monday they get together, and the first thing they do is they hit their knees and they pray about how they should cast every vote. They ask God for guidance on that. We have more than 100 of these members of Congress that are actively seeking God's help. Now, I will tell you that just a few years ago, there wasn't 20 members in that group, but now we've got 100. So we're having some really good guys. We're recruiting more to run. So I'm seeing really good stuff. I'm seeing the same stuff at the state legislative level. Again, we've had a network of state legislators for over 20 years. There are more biblical thinkers in state government today than I've seen in my lifetime. Not enough yet. It needs to grow. We need a lot of states don't have majorities yet. In some states, we do have a majority of biblical thinkers in the legislatures of some states. So I think this is really, really healthy, really helpful. From my standpoint, a revival is something that spans decades. What we call the First Great Awakening went from 1730 to 1770. That's a 40-year revival. That's usually how long it takes to change hearts and change the culture. The Second Great Awakening went from 1801 to 1878. That's 77 years. Revivals generally span decades because people don't change fast. It takes a while to change our thinking and our behavior. I'm seeing that. I think that's happening. When I look at young people, even though polling right now shows the worst results among millennials and Gen Zs in the sense that I think 58% of millennials were born in a home without a mother and a father. And so as a result, they are the most unmarried generation in American history. They didn't see the benefit of marriage because they didn't have good ones to their parents, so they don't want marriage. So it's become a rite of passage. Cohabitation is a common thing with millennials. I can take you through all the stats. The morals of millennials is not, but what's interesting is they're responding to the culture. I have never seen groups of young people like millennials and Gen Zers change as fast as they are when they've been exposed to truth. They just haven't had truth. I've never seen a generation that is so open to truth, so willing to embrace it when they hear it, and so passionate about it after they get it. One of the things we do in the summer is we run a summer institute for 18 to 25 years old. These are kids going into college, they're in college, or they've come out of college and they're postgraduate work. And so we know what they get taught in college. We know what the professors say, we know how to respond to that. And what we do for 2 weeks is we take these kids into what's called apologetics. We teach them how to think. 1 Peter 3:15, give an answer for the hope that's in you. Most young people can tell you what they believe, they can't tell you why they believe what they believe. And so knowing why you have that hope is what's missing. And this goes back to Woodrow Wilson, progressives, when they took education, they changed education from teaching people how to think to teaching them how to learn. As a learner, you just receive whatever you're given. So whatever I see in social media, whatever I get in the news, that's what a thinker says, wait a minute, there's another side to that somewhere. I need to investigate both sides. So what we do for the first 2 or 3 days is we don't care whether they agree with us or not. We ask them so many questions about what they believe, they figure out they don't know what they believe and they don't know why. So once you tear them down, then you can come back and say, all right, let's talk about this. Let's look at this from all sides. And by the way, here's these 160,000 original documents. You've been told this, but here's the truth back here. You want to go see it and you want to hold it yourself? And so what happens is after 2 weeks, every single year, we have these kids go back and convert professors. And don't think I mean religious conversion. I mean convert them. Because one of the things we teach them is what Jesus did. In the Gospels, Jesus asked 337 questions in the Gospels. Asking questions is what makes you think. Jesus did not answer many questions. He asked a ton of questions. And when he asked people questions, they would have to think or he'd shut them up and they didn't have an answer. And so what we do is we teach young people how to ask questions about their professors, being completely respectful. We don't want them challenging professors. A good example, we got a text from a kid who said, hey, were the Founding Fathers all raging alcoholics? And we said, ha, 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 funny, funny. And then it struck us, I wonder if that was a serious question. You know, we thought that was a kid question. And said, why do you ask? He said, well, one of my professors just said that all the Founding Fathers were raging alcoholics. I don't think that's right, but I don't know if that's true or not. We said, oh, so it's a serious question. I said, okay, here's what you do. Go back to your professor and tell your professor, that is the most interesting thing I've ever heard in my life. I've never heard that. That's so interesting. I want to find out more about that. Can you give me some sources where I can go study that? And the professor said, actually, I think I read that in an article in Huffington Post. And she heard herself say that and said, ooh, that's not very academic, is it? And so he went and looked at the article in Huffington Post and came back and said, I looked at the article but didn't have any footnotes in it. I'm trying to find some sources on this. They had some stuff in the article, but there's some sources. She said, well, I do think I saw a 1-hour special on the History Channel one time that talked about that. He said, but there's no footnotes on it. She said, you know, I guess I probably shouldn't say that anymore, should I? Bingo. We've seen professors change from being socialist to free market. We've seen professors being changed from pro-abortion to pro-life simply because the kids ask them questions that make them think. So I am so excited. I've never been as excited over a generation of kids as I'm seeing right now because they're so willing and passionate to embrace truth. They learn, and then they become great evangelists for truth. They have a passion for truth, and I think it's super healthy. So I encourage you, if you have not, find a young person around and just create a relationship with them. Build a trust relationship. Get in a mentor positionship because 58% of these kids do not have a good family growing up. They want some relationships. Spend the time with them. Go get ice cream or Coke or coffee or whatever. Go to Starbucks and talk about serious issues. And as you do, you will find them wide open to helpful information. And don't try to convert them in one weekend. Don't try to say, you're a bunch of socialists, I'm going to make you free market. Don't do that. Build a relationship like Jesus did with his disciples, and then you can have a better conversation. Sorry, I got carried away on that one.
No. I think we're good. Hey, let's give this guy a huge hand for coming and blessing our city. Come on. Rich and Bott Radio, thank you again for having them in.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you, David. God bless you. Amen. Let me just pray over us. And again, on your way out, if you want to hit the resources that are out there. Father, we thank you, Lord. God, we ask you to bless tonight, that you put this deep in our hearts and cause the conviction of the Holy Spirit to stir in us, Lord. Give us faith, Lord, to see tomorrow and what you're doing and get involved. God, help us to be courageous and not afraid. Lord, we love you in the name of Jesus. Amen and amen. God bless you.